The desert sun beat down mercilessly on Camp Pendleton as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her dusty uniform and walked toward the motor pool. At 28, she had the lean build of someone who had spent years in combat zones, but today she moved with deliberate care, her steps measured and her expression carefully neutral. The weight of her deception pressed against her chest like a physical thing. 3 months ago, General Maria Elena Santos Rodriguez had been sitting in a climate-controlled briefing room at the Pentagon, surrounded by maps and intelligence reports that painted a troubling picture. Reports of widespread misconduct, abuse of power, and a toxic culture that was eating the Marine Corps from within. The kind of problems that couldn't be solved from behind a mahogany desk. "We need someone on the ground," Defense Secretary Williams had said, his weathered face grim. "Someone who can see what's really happening without the usual smoke and mirrors that come with brass visits." Maria had volunteered immediately. She had clawed her way up from enlisted ranks, earning her stars through blood, sweat, and countless deployments. She knew what it was like to be overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed. Now, stripped of her general's stars and wearing the chevrons of a staff sergeant, she was about to experience it all over again. The motor pool buzzed with activity as Marines worked on various vehicles under the scorching California sun. Maria approached the duty desk where Sergeant Mike Torres was reviewing maintenance schedules. At 25, Torres had the swagger that came with being considered one of the best mechanics on base, though his attitude toward authority was questionable at best. "Sergeant Torres?" Maria kept her voice steady, professional. "I'm Staff Sergeant Santos. I've been assigned to your unit." Torres looked up from his clipboard, his eyes scanning her from head to toe with barely concealed disdain. "Santos, huh? Let me guess. Another diversity hire trying to play with the big boys." The words hit like a slap, but Maria forced herself to remain calm. This was exactly the kind of attitude she was here to document. "I have 8 years of experience with heavy vehicle maintenance, Sergeant. I'm here to do my job." 8 years? Torres snorted. "Doing what? Changing oil in some rear echelon motor pool? This isn't the Girl Scouts, sweetheart. We work on real equipment here." Several other Marines had stopped their work to watch the exchange. Maria could feel their eyes on her, some curious, others already dismissive. She recognized the dynamic immediately, the new person being tested, their worthiness measured and found wanting before they even had a chance to prove themselves. "I understand you have concerns about new personnel," Maria replied evenly. "I'm willing to demonstrate my capabilities." Torres laughed, a harsh sound that carried across the motor pool. "Demonstrate? Lady, half these vehicles weigh more than you do. This isn't about being politically correct or giving everyone a participation trophy. This is about Marines who depend on this equipment coming home alive." The accusation that she was somehow less capable, less committed to Marine safety, struck deep. Maria had lost Marines under her command, had made the terrible decisions that came with leadership in combat. She had earned every star on her shoulder through sacrifice that Torres couldn't begin to imagine. "Which vehicle needs the most urgent attention?" she asked instead of responding to his provocation. Torres gestured toward a massive mine-resistant, ambush-protected vehicle parked in the corner. "That MARAP has been giving us hell for 2 weeks. Transmission keeps slipping. Engine runs rough and the electrical system is completely fried. 3 different mechanics have worked on it, including me. If you think you can waltz in here and fix what we couldn't, be my guest." Maria walked over to the vehicle, very aware that every Marine in the motor pool was now watching her. The MRAP was indeed a beast of a machine, designed to protect Marines from roadside bombs and small arms fire. She had ridden in dozens of similar vehicles during her deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq, both as a young enlisted Marine and later as an officer. She popped the hood and immediately saw several problems that had been overlooked. Years of experience, both in the field and in advanced military engineering courses, had given her insights that most mechanics simply didn't have. The electrical issues were symptoms of a deeper problem with the grounding system, and the transmission problems stemmed from improper fluid that was reacting badly with seals that had been replaced with the wrong specifications. "Sergeant Torres," she called out, "do you have the maintenance logs for this vehicle?" "Maintenance logs?" Torres walked over, his expression skeptical. "What's that going to tell you that looking at the engine won't?" Maria spent the next hour going through the logs, cross-referencing part numbers and service dates. The pattern became clear. Someone had been ordering cheaper, non-specification parts to save money, not realizing that they were creating cascading failures throughout the vehicle's systems. As she worked, she became aware of conversations around her that the Marines thought she couldn't hear. "Look at her, acting like she knows something we don't," muttered Corporal Johnson, a heavy-set man with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails. "Probably learned everything she knows from YouTube videos." "Give her a few hours," replied Lance Corporal Davis, barely 20 and trying to impress his seniors. "She'll be crying to transfer to admin when she realizes this isn't like fixing her boyfriend's pickup truck." The casual dismissal would have been infuriating under normal circumstances, but Maria forced herself to see it as valuable intelligence. This wasn't just about her. This was about how these Marines viewed all women in their ranks, how they treated anyone they perceived as different or lesser. By midday, she had identified the core problems and begun ordering the correct replacement parts. But as she worked, Torres seemed determined to make her life difficult at every turn. "Santos!" he barked as she was torquing a bolt to specification. "That's not how we do things here. We do them right, not by the book." Maria paused, wrench in hand. "The technical manual specifies this torque setting for a reason, Sergeant. These bolts secure the transmission mount." "The manual was written by some pencil pusher who's never turned a wrench in combat," Torres shot back. "I've been doing this for 7 years. I know what works." It was exactly this kind of attitude that led to vehicle failures in the field. Exactly the kind of dangerous corner cutting that got Marines killed. But Maria couldn't say that without revealing knowledge that a staff sergeant shouldn't have. "I understand your experience is valuable," she said instead. "But these specifications exist because improper installation has led to failures in combat situations." Torres stepped closer, using his height advantage to try to intimidate her. "Are you questioning my methods, Staff Sergeant? Because last I checked, you've been here exactly 1 day. And I've been keeping these vehicles running since before you knew what a torque wrench was." The confrontation had drawn attention from across the motor pool. Maria could see other Marines gathering, some openly amused by the spectacle, others uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. "I'm not questioning your dedication," Maria replied carefully. "I'm following established procedures to ensure this vehicle is safe for the Marines who'll depend on it." "Safe?" Torres's voice rose. "You want to talk about safe. Safe is knowing that the person working on your gear has been tested under fire, has proven themselves when it matters. Not someone who got their rank handed to them because the Corps needed to meet some diversity quota." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Maria felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. She had earned her rank through combat tours that Torres had never seen, through decisions and sacrifices that haunted her dreams. But she couldn't defend herself without blowing her cover. "My qualifications and experience speak for themselves," she said instead, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Do they?" Torres laughed again, "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're afraid to get your hands dirty. Real Marines don't need to hide behind regulations and technical manuals." It was a trap, Maria realized. If she backed down, she would be seen as weak and ineffective. If she pushed back too hard, she risked escalating the situation beyond what was useful for her investigation. But Torres had just made a crucial mistake. He had equated following proper procedures with cowardice. Exactly the kind of dangerous thinking that led to the problems she was here to investigate. "Sergeant Torres," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded thousands of Marines in combat. "Following proper procedures isn't about fear. It's about ensuring that Marines come home alive. Every shortcut, every good enough repair, every time we decide we know better than the engineers who designed this equipment, that's when people die." The motor pool had gone quiet. Even Torres seemed taken aback by the intensity in her voice. When a transmission mount fails because someone decided the torque specification was just a suggestion, Maria continued, the vehicle becomes a death trap. When electrical systems fail because someone used the wrong wire gauge to save a few dollars, Marines lose communications when they need them most. This isn't about following rules for the sake of rules. It's about professional competence and moral responsibility. Torres's face had flushed red. Whether from anger or embarrassment, Maria couldn't tell. "You think you can come in here and lecture us about responsibility? About what it means to be a Marine?" "I think I can do my job according to established standards," Maria replied. "And I think Marines deserve equipment they can trust with their lives." The standoff lasted several long seconds before Torres finally stepped back. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "Do it your way. But when that vehicle breaks down in the field because your by-the-book approach doesn't account for real-world conditions, that's on you." As Torres stormed off, Maria returned to her work, very aware that the entire motor pool was still watching her. She had won this particular battle, but she knew it was far from over. Torres's hostility wasn't just personal. It was symptomatic of a deeper cultural problem that valued bravado over competence, loyalty over accountability. The rest of the day passed in tense quiet. Marines continued their work around her, but conversations stopped when she approached, and requests for tools or assistance were met with barely concealed reluctance. By evening, when the motor pool finally shut down for the day, Maria felt the weight of isolation that came with being the outsider, the one who didn't belong. As she walked back to her quarters, she reflected on everything she had observed: the casual sexism, the dangerous shortcuts, the toxic leadership style that prioritized dominance over competence. It was all worse than the reports had indicated. And this was just her first day. In her small room, Maria pulled out a secure satellite phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. "General Santos," came the familiar voice of her aide, Colonel Jennifer Park. How's the investigation proceeding, ma'am?" Maria stared out the small window at the darkening base. "It's worse than we thought, Jen. Much worse. The cultural problems run deep, and they're directly impacting operational readiness. Do you need extraction? We can have you out of there in 6 hours if the situation is untenable." Maria considered it. Every instinct told her to reveal her true rank, to use her authority to start making immediate changes. But real change required understanding the full scope of the problem, and that meant enduring whatever came next. "Negative," she said finally. "I need to see how deep this goes. But Jen, make sure someone is monitoring this situation. If these attitudes are widespread, we're looking at a readiness crisis that could get people killed." After ending the call, Maria sat on her narrow bunk and tried to process the day's events. She had been a general for 5 years, accustomed to respect, to having her orders followed without question. The transition back to being treated as a junior enlisted Marine was jarring in ways she hadn't anticipated. But it was also illuminating. She was seeing her Marine Corps from a perspective she had never had as an officer, experiencing firsthand the daily reality of Marines who didn't have stars on their collars or the power to change systems that failed them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her resolve and her cover story. Torres clearly wasn't finished with her, and she suspected that her refusal to back down had only escalated the conflict. But Maria Santos Rodriguez hadn't become a general by backing down from difficult situations. As she prepared for sleep, one thought kept returning. How many other Marines were suffering under leaders like Torres? How many were being dismissed, marginalized, or put at risk because they didn't fit someone's narrow definition of what a Marine should be? The investigation was just beginning, but already she knew that the problems went far beyond what any Pentagon briefing could capture. This was about the soul of the Marine Corps, about whether it could evolve to become the inclusive professional force America needed, or whether it would remain trapped in outdated attitudes that served no one. Outside her window, the base settled into its nighttime rhythm, unaware that a general was sleeping in enlisted quarters, planning the next phase of an investigation that would challenge everything they thought they knew about leadership, respect, and what it truly meant to be a Marine. The second week at Camp Pendleton brought no relief from the hostile atmosphere in the motor pool. If anything, Torres seemed to have taken Maria's competence as a personal challenge to his authority. Each morning brought new attempts to undermine her work, question her methods, and isolate her from the rest of the unit. Maria arrived early that Tuesday morning to find that someone had tampered with the MRAP she had been working on. The new parts she had carefully installed according to specifications had been removed and replaced with the same substandard components that had caused the original problems. Worse, the work had been done carelessly, with stripped bolts and cross-threaded fittings that would require hours to repair properly. Problem, Santos? Torres appeared beside her, his tone mockingly innocent. Maria studied the sabotaged work, her jaw tight with controlled anger. Someone undid the repairs I made yesterday, used incorrect parts and damaged the mounting points in the process. Huh. Torres scratched his chin theatrically. That's weird. Maybe your work wasn't as solid as you thought. These vehicles see a lot of use. Sometimes repairs just don't hold up under real-world conditions. It was a lie, and they both knew it. Maria had documented her work with photos and part numbers, following protocols that Torres apparently considered optional. But calling him out directly would only escalate a situation she needed to handle carefully. The vehicle hasn't moved since yesterday, she replied evenly. Someone deliberately reversed my repairs. That's a pretty serious accusation, Staff Sergeant. You suggesting one of my Marines would sabotage equipment? Torres's voice carried a dangerous edge now, loud enough to draw attention from nearby Marines. Maria found herself in an impossible position. She could prove sabotage, but doing so would require making formal accusations against Marines she was supposed to be investigating covertly. Yet allowing the behavior to continue would put lives at risk when these vehicles were deployed. I'm suggesting that someone needs to explain why properly installed components were removed and replaced with parts that don't meet specifications, she said carefully. Corporal Johnson wandered over, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. Maybe the new girl just made a mistake. Happens to the best of us when we're trying to prove something we're not ready for. Lance Corporal Davis nodded enthusiastically. Yeah, I've seen it before. Someone tries to show off, cuts corners to look fast and efficient, then blames others when it falls apart. Maria felt the familiar burn of injustice. These Marines were gaslighting her, making her question her own professional competence in front of witnesses. It was a classic bullying tactic, designed to make the target doubt themselves and eventually break down. The documentation is clear, she replied. Photos show the correct parts properly installed. The current configuration doesn't match that documentation. Torres stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate. Documentation? Photos? Christ, Santos, this is a motor pool, not a crime scene. We fix vehicles here, we don't play detective. We also don't sabotage equipment that Marines depend on, Maria shot back, her patience finally beginning to fray. The motor pool went quiet. Torres's expression shifted from mockery to genuine anger, his face flushing red above his collar. Sabotage? His voice was dangerously low. You better be real careful about throwing that word around, Staff Sergeant. That's not an accusation you make lightly in the Marine Corps. Maria realized she had crossed a line, pushed too hard too fast. But the anger she felt wasn't just about the sabotaged repairs. It was about every Marine who had ever been dismissed, undermined, or had their professional competence questioned because they didn't fit someone's narrow expectations. I'm concerned about vehicle readiness, she said, trying to de-escalate. When repairs are reversed overnight, that raises questions about our maintenance procedures. Our procedures? Torres laughed harshly. Lady, you've been here 10 days. We've been maintaining these vehicles for years before you showed up, and we'll be doing it long after you wash out and transfer to some nice safe admin job. The prediction stung because Maria knew it reflected a broader assumption, that women, especially women who stood up for themselves, wouldn't last in the demanding environment of the motor pool. How many capable Marines had been driven away by exactly this kind of treatment? I'm not planning to transfer anywhere, Maria replied. I'm here to do my job. Your job? Corporal Johnson interjected. Your job is to learn from Marines who've been doing this longer than you, not come in here acting like you know better than everyone else. It was a catch-22 that Maria recognized from her own early military career. Be assertive and be labeled as arrogant and insubordinate. Be deferential and be dismissed as weak and incompetent. For women and minorities, the acceptable middle ground was often impossibly narrow. I'm willing to learn, Maria said carefully, but I also have to maintain professional standards. Torres snorted. Professional standards. Right. Tell you what, Santos, since you're so concerned about doing things by the book, you can handle all the paperwork for the motor pool. Inventory reports, maintenance logs, parts orders, all that bureaucratic bullshit that keeps us from actually fixing vehicles. It was clearly meant as punishment, a way to bury her in administrative work while keeping her away from the actual mechanical repairs. But Maria recognized an opportunity. Paperwork would give her access to maintenance records, parts procurement, and personnel files, exactly the kind of documentation she needed for her investigation. "Understood, Sergeant," she replied. Torres seemed surprised by her acceptance. He had probably expected her to protest, to give him an excuse for further punishment. Her compliance clearly threw off his rhythm. "Good," he said finally. "Maybe you'll learn something about how this place actually works." The rest of the day passed in uncomfortable tension. Maria found herself assigned to a small office adjoining the motor pool, where towers of paperwork awaited her attention. As she sorted through maintenance logs and parts orders, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The cheaper, non-specification parts weren't just being used occasionally to save money. They were being systematically substituted across all vehicle types. Worse, the paperwork was being falsified to hide the substitutions. Official records showed genuine parts being ordered and installed, while the actual components being used were significantly inferior. Maria photographed key documents with her personal phone, building a case that would eventually require formal investigation. But as she worked, she became aware that her activities were being monitored. Marines found excuses to walk past the office, glancing at her work with obvious suspicion. Around midday, Lance Corporal Davis knocked on the doorframe. "Staff Sergeant? Sergeant Torres wants to see you in the maintenance bay." Maria found Torres standing beside a Humvee with its hood raised. The engine compartment was a maze of wires, hoses, and mechanical components that looked like they had been assembled by someone with no understanding of proper procedures. "This vehicle just came back from a convoy exercise," Torres said without preamble. "Engines running rough, electrical system is completely fried. The Marines who were driving it say it started having problems about 50 miles out, but they managed to nurse it back to base." Maria studied the engine bay, immediately recognizing several serious problems. Wiring had been spliced incorrectly, creating fire hazards. Fluid lines had been rerouted in ways that put them at risk of damage from road debris. Most concerning, several safety systems appeared to have been bypassed entirely. "This vehicle shouldn't have been allowed to operate in this condition," she said, unable to keep the concern from her voice. Torres shrugged. "Sometimes you have to make do with what you've got." These Marines had a mission to complete. A mission that could have gotten them killed if this vehicle had caught fire or broken down in hostile territory, Maria replied. The casual disregard for Marine safety was exactly the kind of attitude that led to preventable casualties. "That's a pretty dramatic way of looking at things," Corporal Johnson said from across the bay. "We've been keeping these vehicles running with creative solutions for years." Creative solutions. Maria had heard that euphemism before, usually right before someone explained why they had ignored established procedures and put lives at risk. In her years as a general, she had seen too many incident reports that began with creative solutions and ended with casualties. "Some of these modifications create serious safety hazards," she said, pointing to the bypassed fire suppression system. "If this vehicle had caught fire, the Marines inside wouldn't have had any protection." Torres stepped closer again, his intimidation tactic apparently his go-to response whenever his decisions were questioned. "You know what creates hazards? Vehicles that don't run at all because some mechanic was too worried about following every single regulation to get the job done." It was the same false choice Maria had encountered throughout her career. Safety versus mission accomplishment, as if the two were mutually exclusive rather than complementary. Good leaders understood that cutting safety corners ultimately undermined mission effectiveness. "Properly maintained vehicles accomplish more missions with fewer casualties," she replied. "Shortcuts like these put Marines at unnecessary risk." "Unnecessary risk?" Torres's voice rose again. "You want to talk about unnecessary risk? The unnecessary risk is having Marines depend on equipment maintained by someone who's more concerned with paperwork than performance." The argument was drawing attention again. Maria could see Marines throughout the motor pool stopping their work to watch the confrontation. Some looked uncomfortable with Torres's aggressive behavior, but none seemed willing to intervene. "I'm concerned with both," Maria said. Proper documentation ensures that maintenance is performed correctly and consistently. Consistently wrong, Davis chimed in, when you're so worried about following procedures that you can't adapt to real-world conditions. The young Marine's comment revealed how deeply the toxic attitudes had penetrated the unit culture. Junior Marines were learning that disregarding established procedures was not only acceptable but admirable, a sure recipe for future disasters. Real-world conditions require more attention to safety procedures, not less, Maria replied. When Marines are depending on this equipment in combat situations, there's no margin for error. Torres laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Combat situations? When exactly have you been in combat, Santos? Because your record shows motor pool assignments and technical schools, not exactly the front lines. The fabricated service record Maria was operating under necessarily omitted her combat deployments as an officer. Torres was using that constructed weakness against her, but his attack revealed something important. He clearly had access to personnel files and was using them to undermine Marines he wanted to intimidate. My experience is documented in my service record, she said carefully. Right, documented, Torres sneered. Like everything else you do. Tell me something, Santos. When you're filling out all that paperwork, do you ever think about the Marines who are actually out there fighting? The ones who need their vehicles to work, not just look good on an inspection. It was a masterful piece of manipulation, positioning himself as the defender of combat Marines while portraying Maria as a bureaucrat who didn't understand real military service. The technique was particularly effective because it contained just enough truth to be believable. Paperwork, for its own sake, was indeed a military problem. But Maria had been the one making life-and-death decisions about vehicle maintenance when Torres was still learning basic mechanical skills. She had seen firsthand what happened when creative solutions failed at the worst possible moments. I think about Marines every time I ensure a vehicle meets safety standards, she replied, because Marines deserve equipment they can trust with their lives. The conversation might have continued, but it was interrupted by the arrival of Gunnery Sergeant Williams, the motor pool's senior non-commissioned officer. Williams was a career Marine with 22 years of service, old enough to have worked with Marines from all backgrounds, and experienced enough to recognize toxic leadership when he saw it. What's the situation here? Williams's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. Torres straightened slightly, though his aggressive posture remained. Just discussing maintenance procedures with Staff Sergeant Santos, Gunny. Seems like there are some disagreements about how we do things here. Williams looked between Torres and Maria, taking in the tension and the watching Marines. Disagreements about what specifically? Staff Sergeant Santos thinks our field expedient repairs are unsafe, Torres said, his tone making it clear he thought Maria was being unreasonably picky. Williams walked over to the Humvee and spent several minutes examining the questionable modifications. His expression grew increasingly grim as he identified each safety violation and procedural shortcut. These modifications aren't field expedient, he said finally. They're dangerous. Who authorized bypassing the fire suppression system? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Torres shifted uncomfortably, apparently not expecting Williams to side with Maria's assessment. We needed to get the vehicle operational quickly, Torres said defensively. Sometimes you have to prioritize mission accomplishment over theoretical safety concerns. Theoretical? Williams's voice was dangerously quiet. Sergeant, I've seen Marines die because someone decided safety procedures were theoretical. These modifications will be reversed immediately, and this vehicle will be deadlined until it meets proper specifications. The rebuke was public and decisive. Maria watched Torres's face cycle through anger, embarrassment, and resentment as his authority was undermined in front of the entire motor pool. Gunny, we've been maintaining these vehicles this way for... Torres began. For too long, Williams cut him off. Staff Sergeant Santos is correct. These modifications create unacceptable risks to Marine safety. The validation from a senior NCO changed the dynamic in the motor pool immediately. Marines who had been watching the confrontation with amusement now looked uncomfortable, perhaps recognizing that they had been watching workplace harassment rather than legitimate professional disagreement. All Marines will report to the conference room at 1300 for a safety briefing, Williams announced. We're going to review proper maintenance procedures and ensure everyone understands the standards expected in this unit." As Marines reluctantly began moving toward the conference room, Williams approached Maria privately. "Staff Sergeant, I owe you an apology. This behavior should have been addressed much sooner." Maria felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief at finally having support, but also concern about how her intervention was affecting the investigation. Williams's backing would make her job easier, but it might also make Torres and others more cautious about revealing their true attitudes. "Thank you, Gunnery Sergeant. I'm just trying to ensure Marine safety." Williams studied her for a moment. "You've got more experience than your record shows, don't you?" The observation was perceptive and dangerous. Williams had clearly recognized something in Maria's knowledge and bearing that didn't match her supposed background. "I've learned a lot from good Marines over the years," she replied carefully. Williams nodded slowly. "Well, you've got good instincts. Keep doing what you're doing." As the safety briefing proceeded, Maria found herself in an awkward position. Her cover was holding, but the support from Williams had shifted the unit dynamics in ways that might compromise her ability to observe the worst behaviors. Torres and his allies would likely be more careful now, more subtle in their harassment and corner-cutting. But the day had also revealed the scope of the problem she was investigating. The systematic use of substandard parts, the falsified documentation, the toxic leadership that valued compliance over competence. It all pointed to institutional failures that went far beyond one motor pool. That evening, Maria made another secure call to Colonel Park. "The situation is more complex than we initially assessed," she reported. "We have senior NCOs who recognize the problems and junior leaders who are perpetuating them. The cultural issues are creating real safety risks. Do you need additional support? We could arrange for an official inspection that would give you cover to document violations." Maria considered the offer. An official inspection would certainly uncover the safety violations and procedural shortcuts she had discovered, but it would also end her ability to observe the day-to-day behaviors that created the toxic environment in the first place. "Not yet," she decided. "I need to understand how deep this culture goes and who else is involved. But Jen, start preparing briefings for the Commandant. This isn't just about one unit. It's about institutional failures that could be affecting readiness corps-wide." After ending the call, Maria reflected on the day's events. She had won a tactical victory with Williams's support, but the war for the soul of the motor pool was far from over. Torres's humiliation would likely make him more dangerous, not less, and she still had no idea how many other Marines shared his toxic attitudes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her resolve and her carefully constructed cover story. But today had also shown her that there were Marines like Williams who recognized good leadership when they saw it, who valued competence over conformity. The investigation was evolving in ways she hadn't anticipated, but Maria was more convinced than ever that it was necessary. The Marine Corps she loved deserved better than leaders who put their own egos ahead of Marine safety. Better than a culture that drove away good Marines because they didn't fit narrow stereotypes. As she settled in for another night in enlisted quarters, Maria Santos Rodriguez began planning the next phase of an investigation that was becoming more personal with each passing day. Because this wasn't just about documenting problems anymore. It was about saving the institution that had given her everything and ensuring it could continue to serve Marines who deserved nothing less than the best leadership the Corps could provide. 3 weeks into her assignment, Maria had settled into an uncomfortable routine at Camp Pendleton. The motor pool operated under a fragile truce following Gunnery Sergeant Williams's intervention, but the underlying tensions remained. Torres had become more subtle in his harassment, using administrative weapons and social isolation instead of direct confrontation. The shift in tactics became clear when Maria discovered she had been systematically excluded from important meetings and training opportunities. While other Marines attended advanced technical courses or participated in cross-training exercises, she found herself assigned to increasingly menial tasks, inventory counts, equipment cleaning, and paperwork that seemed designed more to waste her time than accomplish any meaningful purpose. "Santos, I need you to conduct a complete inventory of the tool room," Torres announced on a Wednesday morning, handing her a clipboard with dozens of pages of equipment lists. Every wrench, every screwdriver, every socket. full accountability. Maria looked at the extensive list, knowing that the task would take the better part of 2 days to complete properly. Has there been a discrepancy in the tool inventory? Torres shrugged. Tools have been going missing. Someone needs to figure out what's unaccounted for. Apparently, the implication was clear. Tools were being stolen, and as the newest member of the unit, Maria was the most likely suspect. It was another classic intimidation tactic, designed to make her feel like a criminal while simultaneously isolating her from meaningful work. I'll start immediately, she replied, refusing to take the bait. As Maria began the tedious process of counting and cataloging thousands of tools, she became aware of conversations taking place just outside the tool room. Marines spoke freely, apparently forgetting or not caring that she could hear their discussions. I don't know why we're stuck with her, complained Lance Corporal Davis. She's not pulling her weight, always questioning how we do things. Torres said she filed some kind of complaint about the Humvee repairs, added Corporal Johnson, making us all look bad because she can't handle real Marine Corps maintenance. The distortion of events was breathtaking. Maria's identification of serious safety violations had been reframed as an inability to handle military standards. Her professional competence was being questioned while the Marines who had created dangerous conditions were positioning themselves as victims of her unreasonable expectations. But the most troubling part of the conversation came when Private Rodriguez, a new Marine fresh from technical school, joined the discussion. My instructor at 29 Palms said female Marines in technical fields have higher failure rates, Rodriguez said. Maybe she's just not cut out for this kind of work. The statement revealed how deeply sexist attitudes had penetrated Marine Corps culture. A young Marine, barely out of training, was already repeating stereotypes that would shape his interactions with female colleagues throughout his career. How many promising careers had been derailed by this kind of prejudice? It's not just about being female, Davis replied. It's about being soft. The Corps has gotten too worried about feelings and not worried enough about warfighting. Maria felt her jaw clench. The false dichotomy between treating Marines with dignity and maintaining combat readiness was one of the most destructive myths in military culture. Professional, respectful treatment of all Marines actually improved unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. But that nuance was lost in the machismo that many Marines confused with leadership. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Gunnery Sergeant Williams, whose presence immediately changed the dynamic. What are you Marines discussing? Williams asked. Just talking about work assignments, Gunny, Davis replied quickly. Williams looked skeptical but didn't pursue the matter. Well, get back to those assignments. We have vehicles to maintain. As the Marines dispersed, Williams entered the tool room where Maria was methodically working through the inventory. How's the count going, Staff Sergeant? About halfway complete, Gunnery Sergeant. So far, everything appears to be accounted for. Williams nodded, but his expression suggested he had something else on his mind. Santos, can I speak with you privately? Maria followed Williams to his office, a small space adjoining the motor pool that was crowded with maintenance manuals, personnel files, and photographs from various deployments. Williams closed the door and gestured for her to take a seat. I'm going to be direct with you, Williams began. I've been watching the situation in this motor pool, and I'm concerned about what I'm seeing. Maria felt a moment of panic. Had Williams discovered her true identity? Was her cover blown? Concerned about what specifically, Gunnery Sergeant? Williams leaned back in his chair, studying her. I've been a Marine for 26 years. I've seen good Marines and bad Marines, and I've learned to recognize the difference. You're a good Marine, Santos. Your technical knowledge is solid, your work ethic is excellent, and you ask the right questions. Maria relaxed slightly, but remained cautious. Thank you, Gunnery Sergeant. But I'm also seeing treatment that isn't acceptable. Marines who should know better are creating a hostile work environment, and it needs to stop. The admission was both validating and concerning. If Williams could see the harassment, it meant Maria's cover wasn't as convincing as she had hoped. But it also meant she had an ally who might be willing to help address the toxic culture. I can handle the situation, Gunnery Sergeant, she said carefully. Williams shook his head. This isn't about you handling it. This is about leadership, failing to create an environment where all Marines can do their jobs effectively. I should have addressed this sooner. Maria found herself in a delicate position. She needed to maintain her cover while also gathering information about how the command structure responded to reports of harassment and discrimination. What would you recommend, Gunnery Sergeant? Williams was quiet for several moments, apparently wrestling with a difficult decision. I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you been subjected to harassment or discrimination in this unit? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Maria could provide a detailed account of the behavior she had experienced, but doing so might trigger official investigations that would compromise her mission. On the other hand, failing to report might allow the toxic behavior to continue unchecked. There have been some challenging interactions, she said carefully. Challenging how? Maria chose her words deliberately. Some Marines seem to question my competence based on assumptions rather than performance. There have been comments about women in technical fields, about diversity quotas, about whether I belong in this unit. Williams' expression darkened. Those aren't challenging interactions, Santos. That's harassment and discrimination. It's unacceptable, and it's against Marine Corps policy. The conversation was moving into territory that Maria hadn't fully prepared for. She needed to balance her role as an investigator with her responsibility to other Marines who might be experiencing similar treatment. I don't want to cause problems for the unit, she said. The unit already has problems, Williams replied firmly. Marines who create hostile work environments are the ones causing problems, not the Marines who report them. It was exactly the kind of leadership response that Maria hoped to see throughout the Corps, but she knew it wasn't universal. Many commands still treated harassment complaints as threats to unit cohesion rather than opportunities to improve. What would happen if I made a formal complaint? She asked. Williams considered the question seriously. Formally, you would file a complaint with the Equal Opportunity Representative, and there would be an investigation. Informally, I would start addressing the behavior immediately through administrative action. And realistically, Williams's hesitation revealed the gap between policy and practice that Maria was investigating. Realistically, you might face retaliation from Marines who see you as a troublemaker. Some leaders might see you as a problem to be managed, rather than a Marine to be supported. The honesty was refreshing but depressing. Williams understood the flaws in the system he was part of, but seemed uncertain about how to fix them. Have you seen this kind of behavior before? Maria asked. More often than I'd like to admit, Williams replied. The Corps has been working to change the culture, but change is slow. Too many Marines still think that treating people with respect somehow makes us weak. Maria seized the opportunity to gather more intelligence. What kind of changes have been most effective? Williams leaned forward, his expression becoming more animated. Consistent enforcement of standards. When Marines see that harassment has real consequences, behavior changes, but it requires leaders at all levels to take it seriously. And when they don't, good Marines leave. We lose talent, experience, and diversity. The Corps becomes less capable of defending the country. It was exactly the connection that Maria had been hoping senior leaders would make, that treating Marines with dignity wasn't just morally right, but operationally necessary. Williams clearly understood the stakes. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Torres entered without waiting for permission, his expression suspicious as he looked between Williams and Maria. Gunny, we need Staff Sergeant Santos back in the motor pool. That inventory isn't going to complete itself. Williams's expression cooled noticeably. Sergeant Torres, I don't recall asking you to monitor my meetings. Torres straightened slightly. Just ensuring work assignments are completed, Gunnery Sergeant. I'll determine when Staff Sergeant Santos is available for work assignments. Right now, she's in my office on official business. The rebuke was subtle but clear. Torres's face reddened, but he nodded and withdrew. After he left, Williams turned back to Maria. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Torres is using work assignments as weapons, trying to control and intimidate Marines he sees as threats. Maria filed the observation away. Torres's behavior was escalating, becoming more overtly abusive as he felt his authority challenged. It was a pattern she had seen before in toxic leaders. When their position was threatened, they often became more dangerous, not less. How long has Sergeant Torres been in this position? She asked. Williams checked a personnel roster. About 8 months. He transferred here from Camp Lejeune after some kind of incident in his previous unit. The revelation was significant. Torres wasn't just a local problem. He was a systemic issue, moved from unit to unit without addressing the underlying behavioral problems. How many other toxic leaders were being shuffled around the Marine Corps instead of being properly disciplined or removed? What kind of incident? Williams hesitated. I don't have all the details, but it involved complaints from female Marines in his previous unit. The transfer was described as in the best interest of all parties. Maria felt a cold anger building in her chest. The Marine Corps had known Torres was a problem and had simply moved him rather than addressing his behavior. Now he was creating the same toxic environment in a new unit, with a new set of victims. Gunnery Sergeant, I think I would like to file a formal complaint. Williams nodded grimly. I think that's the right decision. But Santos, be prepared for this to get difficult. Some Marines are going to see you as the problem, and they're going to make that clear. As Maria left Williams's office, she felt the weight of the decision she had just made. Filing a formal complaint would likely escalate the conflict and potentially compromise her investigation, but allowing the toxic behavior to continue unchecked would betray every Marine who had ever been subjected to similar treatment. The rest of the day passed in tense anticipation. Word seemed to spread quickly through the motor pool that Maria had been in Williams's office for an extended period. Marines watched her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, their conversations stopping when she approached. By evening, the atmosphere had become openly hostile. Tools that she needed for the inventory had mysteriously gone missing. Work orders that should have been straightforward were suddenly complicated by bureaucratic obstacles. Most tellingly, Marines who had been neutral, or even friendly, now avoided her entirely. As Maria finally completed the tool inventory, she discovered that several expensive diagnostic tools were indeed missing. But her investigation revealed that they had been signed out by Torres himself several weeks earlier for use on vehicles that didn't require such specialized equipment. The discovery presented another dilemma. Should she report the irregularity and risk being accused of targeting Torres, or should she document it quietly as part of her larger investigation? The decision was made for her when Torres appeared in the tool room as she was finishing her paperwork. Find anything interesting in your count? His tone was casual, but his eyes were hard. The inventory appears complete except for some diagnostic equipment that was signed out several weeks ago. Torres stepped closer, using his familiar intimidation tactic. Equipment gets used for various projects. Sometimes it takes time to return items to inventory. The sign-out log shows the equipment was requested for use on vehicles that don't require those specific diagnostics, Maria replied. Are you questioning my judgment about what equipment is needed for repairs? The conversation felt like a trap, but Maria had documented everything carefully. I'm noting discrepancies in the inventory as requested. Torres studied her for a long moment, apparently trying to decide how far to push the confrontation. You know, Santos, Marines who ask too many questions sometimes find that their time in the Corps gets complicated. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Torres was warning her that continued resistance would have consequences beyond just workplace harassment. I'm just doing my assigned duties, Sergeant. Right, Torres replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Your assigned duties. Well, make sure you remember what those duties are and what they aren't. As Torres left the tool room, Maria realized that her situation had become significantly more precarious. The formal complaint she was planning to file would likely push Torres over the edge, transforming subtle harassment into open warfare. But as she reflected on the day's events, Maria also felt a renewed sense of purpose. The conversation with Williams had revealed that there were Marines in positions of authority who recognized the problems and wanted to fix them. The challenge was creating systems and culture that supported those leaders while removing the toxic ones. That evening, she made her regular secure call to Colonel Park. The situation is escalating, she reported. I'm going to file a formal complaint tomorrow, which will likely blow my cover within a few days. Are you in physical danger? Maria considered the question carefully. Not immediately, but the threats are becoming more direct. I think Torres is capable of significant retaliation. We can extract you immediately if necessary. Negative. I need to see how the complaint process works, who supports it and who tries to undermine it. This is crucial intelligence for reform efforts. After ending the call, Maria prepared for what she knew would be one of the most challenging periods of her military career. Tomorrow she would cross a line that would make her a target, but it was a line that needed to be crossed. The Marine Corps she loved was being damaged by Marines who put their own prejudices and insecurities ahead of institutional values. As a general, she had the power to demand change from above. But as Staff Sergeant Santos, she was learning what it felt like to fight for change from below, to be the Marine who stood up and said this is wrong, knowing that there would be consequences. The investigation had become personal in ways she hadn't expected, but it had also become more important than ever, because somewhere in the Marine Corps, there were other Marines facing the same choices she was facing, deciding whether to speak up or stay quiet, whether to fight for change or accept the status quo. Tomorrow, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos would find out how much courage it took to be that Marine who stood up, and General Maria Santos Rodriguez would learn whether the institution she had devoted her life to was ready to support the Marines who were brave enough to demand better. The formal complaint process began at 0800 on Thursday morning, when Maria walked into the Equal Opportunity Office and requested to speak with Staff Sergeant Jennifer Chen, the base's EO representative. The small office, tucked away in the administrative building, felt both official and isolated, a place where Marines came to report problems that couldn't be solved through normal channels. Staff Sergeant Chen was a compact, professional woman who had clearly dealt with her share of difficult situations. Her desk was organized with military precision, but the gentle way she offered Maria coffee and asked her to sit suggested someone who understood that Marines seeking EO assistance were often under significant stress. "What brings you here today, Staff Sergeant Santos?" Maria had rehearsed this moment, but sitting across from Chen made the magnitude of what she was doing feel overwhelming. Once she filed this complaint, there would be no going back to quiet observation and covert intelligence gathering. "I need to file a formal complaint regarding harassment and discrimination in my unit." Chen pulled out a standardized form and a digital recorder. "I need to inform you that this conversation is being recorded and that filing an EO complaint initiates a formal investigation process. Are you prepared to proceed?"
"Yes, I am." For the next 2 hours, Maria provided a detailed account of her experiences in the motor pool.
She described Torres's pattern of intimidation, the systematic exclusion from training opportunities, the comments about women and diversity quotas, and the creation of a hostile work environment that affected her ability to perform her duties. Chen took careful notes, asking follow-up questions that revealed her experience with similar cases. "Have you documented any of these incidents?" Maria pulled out a folder containing photographs, work assignments, and written records she had maintained since her arrival. "I've documented everything I could without compromising my safety." "That was smart thinking," Chen replied, reviewing the materials. "Many Marines don't realize how important documentation is in these cases." "What happens next?" Chen explained the process with professional detachment. "Your complaint will be forwarded to the commanding officer within 24 hours. There will be an initial investigation to determine if the allegations warrant a formal inquiry. If they do, witnesses will be interviewed, and all parties will have the opportunity to provide statements. And realistically, what can I expect?" Chen's expression became more guarded. "Every case is different, but I won't lie to you, filing an EO complaint can be challenging. Some Marines will see you as creating problems rather than reporting them. You may face retaliation, and you'll need to document any incidents that occur." It was the same warning Maria had received from Williams, and it reinforced her understanding of how difficult it was for Marines to seek help when facing harassment. The system that was supposed to protect them often left them more vulnerable. "Have you had cases like this before?" Chen nodded grimly. "More than I'd like. The good news is that when leadership takes these complaints seriously, real change can happen. The bad news is that not all leadership responds appropriately." As Maria left the EO office, she felt both relief and apprehension. The formal complaint was filed, but she knew that the real test would come in how her chain of command responded. Within hours, Torres would likely know that she had reported him, and the fragile truce in the motor pool would be shattered. She returned to her unit to find that word had already begun to spread. Marines who made eye contact did so with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility. The atmosphere felt charged with tension, as if everyone was waiting for something explosive to happen. Torres was nowhere to be seen, but Corporal Johnson approached her with barely concealed anger. "Heard you had an interesting morning, Santos." Maria kept her expression neutral. "Just taking care of some administrative business." "Administrative business?" Johnson repeated mockingly. "Is that what we're calling it now?" The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Gunnery Sergeant Williams, who looked grim as he approached. "Staff Sergeant Santos, I need to see you in my office immediately." As they walked across the motor pool, Maria could feel every Marine watching them. The tension was palpable, and she realized that her complaint had already become common knowledge throughout the unit. Williams closed his office door and gestured for her to sit. "I've received notification that an EO complaint has been filed involving members of this unit." "Yes." "Gunnery Sergeant." Williams studied her carefully. "I want you to know that I support your decision to file that complaint, but I also need to prepare you for what's coming next." "What do you mean?" "Lieutenant Colonel Harrison will be conducting the initial investigation. He's old school. He tends to view EO complaints as disruptions to unit cohesion rather than opportunities to address real problems." The warning was deeply concerning. Maria had hoped that filing a formal complaint would trigger a professional, objective investigation. Instead, it seemed likely that she would face skepticism or hostility from the very people charged with protecting her. "What can I expect from that investigation?" Williams hesitated. "Questions about your motivations, your performance, your ability to integrate with the unit. Harrison will probably ask whether you've considered that maybe you're just not a good fit for this environment." The prediction was infuriating but not surprising. Victim blaming was a common response to harassment complaints, particularly when the victim belonged to a group that some leaders viewed as outsiders or intruders. "And if I maintain that the harassment is real and unacceptable, then you'll probably be labeled as a troublemaker, and your time here will become even more difficult." Williams's honesty was appreciated but depressing. The system designed to protect Marines from harassment seemed more focused on protecting the institution from embarrassment. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. Torres entered without waiting for permission. His face flushed with anger. "Gunnery Sergeant, I need to speak with you about false accusations being made against me and my Marines." Williams' expression hardened. "Sergeant Torres, I don't recall inviting you into this meeting." "With respect, Gunny, when someone files bullshit complaints that threaten my career and my Marines' reputation, that becomes my business." The admission that Torres already knew about the complaint revealed how quickly information moved through the unit's informal networks. It also showed his willingness to violate the confidentiality that was supposed to protect Marines who filed EO complaints. "Sergeant Torres, you're out of line. Any discussion of ongoing EO matters needs to go through proper channels." Torres glanced at Maria with undisguised hatred. "Proper channels, right? Maybe if certain Marines used proper channels to address their performance problems, instead of hiding behind complaints about hurt feelings." The characterization of harassment as hurt feelings was exactly the kind of dismissive attitude that Maria was investigating. Torres was demonstrating the toxic leadership that made it difficult for Marines to report legitimate problems. "Sergeant Torres, you need to leave my office immediately," Williams said firmly. "Fine," Torres replied. But his gaze remained fixed on Maria. "But this conversation isn't over." After Torres left, Williams shook his head in frustration. "That's exactly the kind of retaliation that's prohibited, and he just did it right in front of me. Will you report it?" "Absolutely." "But Santos, you need to understand, Torres has allies in this command. Marines who think like he does, who see your complaint as an attack on the way they've always done business." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Williams providing practical advice about documenting any further incidents and maintaining her professional demeanor despite increasing pressure. But as Maria left his office, she felt the weight of being isolated in an increasingly hostile environment. The rest of the day passed in surreal tension. Marines who had previously been neutral now treated her with open suspicion. Work assignments became exercises in passive-aggressive resistance, with critical information withheld or tools mysteriously unavailable when she needed them. The psychological warfare was subtle but effective. Maria found herself second-guessing decisions that should have been routine, wondering if normal workplace difficulties were actually retaliation or just the usual military bureaucracy. The breaking point came late that afternoon when she discovered that someone had sabotaged the Humvee she had been working on. The repairs she had completed that morning had been not only undone, but damaged in ways that would require extensive work to fix properly. This time, however, Maria was ready. She had installed a small concealed camera that captured clear footage of Lance Corporal Davis and Private Rodriguez deliberately damaging the vehicle's electrical system while laughing about teaching the troublemaker a lesson. As she reviewed the footage on her phone, Maria felt a cold fury that had nothing to do with the damaged equipment. These Marines were willfully sabotaging vehicles that other Marines would depend on in combat. Their petty retaliation was putting lives at risk. She immediately documented the sabotage and forwarded the video evidence to Staff Sergeant Chen at the EO office. Within an hour, Chen had contacted the military police, and by evening, both Davis and Rodriguez were in custody facing charges of destruction of government property and retaliation against a protected complainant. The arrest sent shockwaves through the motor pool. Marines who had been openly hostile suddenly became very quiet, apparently realizing that their actions might have legal consequences. But the change in atmosphere felt more like sullen resentment than genuine reform. That evening, Maria received an unexpected visitor. Master Sergeant Patricia Reyes knocked on her door with an expression that was hard to read. Staff Sergeant Santos? I'm Master Sergeant Reyes from the Inspector General's office. I'd like to speak with you about your EO complaint. Maria invited Reyes into her small room, uncertain whether this was a positive development or another challenge to navigate. I've been reviewing your complaint and the initial investigation reports, Reyes began. I have to say, what I'm seeing is deeply concerning. Concerning how? Reyes pulled out a tablet and showed Maria a series of reports and witness statements. Your complaint isn't an isolated incident. We've received similar reports from 3 other bases in the past 6 months, all involving Marines who were transferred from units where they had previous EO issues. The revelation confirmed Maria's suspicions about Torres and suggested that the problems she was investigating were much more widespread than anyone had realized. What does that mean for my case? It means your complaint is part of a larger pattern that the Inspector General is taking very seriously. We're launching a comprehensive investigation into systemic harassment and retaliation throughout the Marine Corps. Reyes spent the next hour interviewing Maria about her experiences, asking detailed questions that revealed a sophisticated understanding of military culture and the dynamics of harassment. Unlike the skepticism she had expected from Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, Reyes approached the investigation with professional thoroughness. I need to ask you something confidential, Reyes said as the interview concluded. Your technical knowledge and leadership insights are remarkably advanced for someone with your documented experience. Is there anything about your background that would explain that? The question hit dangerously close to Maria's true identity. She had been careful to avoid revealing knowledge that Staff Sergeant Santos shouldn't have, but apparently her natural leadership style and deep understanding of military systems had been noticed. I've been fortunate to learn from excellent mentors throughout my career, she replied carefully. Reyes studied her for a moment. Well, whoever those mentors were, they prepared you well. Your documentation and analysis of these problems is exactly what we need to build a comprehensive case. After Reyes left, Maria made her evening call to Colonel Park with a mixture of excitement and concern. The IG is launching a comprehensive investigation, she reported, but they're starting to ask questions about my background. Do you think your cover is compromised? Not yet, but it's getting harder to maintain. The good news is that the investigation is expanding beyond just my case. We're looking at systemic problems across multiple installations. That's what we were hoping for. How much longer do you think you can maintain your cover? Maria considered the question. The arrests that afternoon had changed the dynamic in her unit dramatically. Torres and his allies would likely be more cautious about overt retaliation, but they would also be looking for any excuse to undermine her credibility. Maybe another week or two. But Park? I think we're ready to start the next phase. The evidence we've gathered shows that these problems require intervention at the highest levels. Understood. Start preparing for transition back to your normal duties. But Maria, be careful.
Cornered people can be dangerous, and you've definitely cornered some people. The warning proved prophetic. The next morning, Maria arrived at the motor pool to find Torres waiting for her with a folder full of paperwork. Staff Sergeant Santos, I've been reviewing your performance since your arrival, and I have some serious concerns. The folder contained a detailed critique of her work, filled with allegations of substandard performance, failure to follow orders, and inability to integrate with the unit. Every interaction they had ever had was reframed in the most negative possible light. I'm recommending you for transfer to a position more suited to your capabilities, Torres said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The attempted career assassination was both predictable and infuriating. Torres was using his authority as her supervisor to create an official record that would follow her throughout her career, painting her as an incompetent Marine who couldn't handle demanding assignments. I disagree with your assessment, Maria replied formally. I request the right to provide a written response to these allegations. Of course, Torres replied. That's your right as a Marine. But Santos? Sometimes it's better to accept reality and move on to something more appropriate. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, whose presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the motor pool. Harrison was exactly what Williams had described, an old-school officer whose expression suggested he viewed EO complaints as unnecessary complications. Staff Sergeant Santos, I need to speak with you about your recent allegations. For the next hour, Harrison grilled Maria about her complaint with obvious skepticism. His questions focused more on her motivations and performance than on the behavior she had reported. It became clear that he viewed her as a disruptive influence rather than a Marine reporting legitimate problems. Tell me, Staff Sergeant, Harrison said finally, do you think it's possible that your difficulties in this unit stem from your own inability to adapt to Marine Corps standards rather than from any misconduct by other Marines? The question was designed to make her doubt herself, to accept blame for the harassment she had experienced. It was exactly the kind of victim blaming that Maria had encountered throughout her career, and that she was now investigating systematically. No, sir. I believe the documented incidents constitute clear violations of Marine Corps policy regarding equal opportunity and professional conduct. Harrison's expression grew colder. I see. Well, we'll continue this investigation, but I want you to understand that false accusations against fellow Marines are serious offenses that can result in disciplinary action. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Harrison was warning her that if her allegations couldn't be proven to his satisfaction, she might face consequences for filing them. As Harrison left, Maria realized that her investigation had reached a critical juncture. The formal complaint process was revealing exactly the kind of institutional failures she had been sent to document. Leaders who should have been protecting Marines from harassment were instead protecting the Marines doing the harassing. But the investigation by Master Sergeant Reyes offered hope that real change might be possible. The IG's office seemed to understand the seriousness of the problems and was prepared to take action at levels that could create meaningful reform. That afternoon, Torres made one final attempt to break her resolve. Santos, I want to make you an offer, he said privately. Withdraw your complaint, accept a transfer to admin, and we'll all pretend this misunderstanding never happened. And if I don't, Torres shrugged, then you'll probably find that your remaining time in the Marine Corps becomes very unpleasant. EO complaints have a way of following Marines throughout their careers. It was the moment Maria had been waiting for. A clear attempt at coercion that revealed the full corruption of the system she was investigating. But it was also the moment she realized that her mission was essentially complete. I appreciate the offer, Sergeant, but I'll be maintaining my complaint. That evening, Maria made a final secure call to Colonel Park. It's time, she said simply. I've documented everything we need to document, and staying longer is starting to compromise the investigation. Understood. Transport will arrive at 0600 tomorrow. Are you ready to resume your normal duties? Maria looked around her small enlisted quarters, thinking about all the Marines who lived in similar rooms throughout the Corps. Marines who faced harassment and discrimination without the option of calling in a helicopter extraction and returning to general stars. I'm ready to go back to being a general, she said finally.
but I'll never forget what I learned as Staff Sergeant Santos. The next morning, as Maria waited for her extraction, Gunnery Sergeant Williams approached her with a confused expression. "Santos, there's a helicopter landing on the parade deck. The pilot says he's here to pick up a passenger, but no one's scheduled any flights." Maria shouldered her small bag and walked toward the door. "That would be my ride, Gunnery Sergeant. Your ride? Where are you going?" Maria paused in the doorway, knowing that this was the last moment of her deception. Tomorrow, the Marine Corps would begin implementing changes based on what she had learned. Torres would face disciplinary action. Harrison would be investigated, and new policies would be put in place to protect Marines who reported harassment. "I'm going back to work," she said simply. As the helicopter lifted off from Camp Pendleton, Maria looked down at the motor pool where she had spent the most educational month of her military career. The investigation was complete, but the real work was just beginning. 3 weeks later, General Maria Elena Santos Rodriguez stood before a packed auditorium at the Marine Corps headquarters, delivering a briefing to the commandant and senior leadership about systemic failures in military culture and the urgent need for reform. "The Marine Corps we love is being damaged by Marines who put their own prejudices ahead of our institutional values," she concluded. "But it's also being protected by Marines who have the courage to stand up and say that we can do better. Our job as leaders is to support those Marines and ensure that the Corps becomes worthy of their sacrifice." In the audience, Master Sergeant Patricia Reyes nodded approvingly as she took notes for the comprehensive reforms that would follow. The investigation that had begun with one general's decision to serve as an enlisted Marine was about to transform how the Corps addressed harassment, discrimination, and toxic leadership. The changes wouldn't be easy, and they wouldn't be quick, but they would be real, and they would honor every Marine who had ever been told they didn't belong, every Marine who had ever faced harassment for being different, and every Marine who had ever had the courage to stand up and demand better from the institution they served. General Santos Rodriguez had gone undercover to investigate problems in the Marine Corps. Staff Sergeant Santos had shown her how to solve them,